Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Saturday. Hello. This is the final presentation, the keynote to our League of Women Voters of Oregon Fall Workshop, Civil Discourse in Today's Diverse World. I'm Becky Gladstone, League President. I'd like to take a moment for perspective before introducing our speaker. The League has educated voters and advocated on issues for more than 101 years. We never support or oppose candidates or political parties. We face issues head on, though, and we speak out. For context, so far this year, already 250 times on the record to the Oregon legislature and Governor Brown, our congressional members, and various state agencies, commissions, and task forces. Our positions are based on research, extensive studies, and member consensus. As a 501c3, we are not partisan, and we work to keep the focus on issues as we educate voters by inviting all Oregon candidates to list in our vote411.org for our voters' guides. We hope these presentations, constructive conversations, diffusing contentious conversations, and volunteer development will help all of us meeting virtually, thanks to our amazing staff. You can find resources and recordings shortly on our website, lwvor.org. Now it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Garrett Epps, the Washington Monthly Legal Affairs Editor. After 10 years as the Supreme Court Correspondent for the Atlantic magazine, analyzing evolving jurisprudence and constitutional issues, he's taught constitutional law for 16 years, returning this fall to the University of Oregon. He's written for numerous top-drawer law journals and has penned several books we've recommended to members in our monthly newsletters. He's written for the Washington Post and was president of the Harvard Crimson. And he attended the Women's March on October 2nd in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Professor Epps.
Thank you for that generous introduction. You can hear me, right?
You're great.
And thanks to the League and thanks to my old friend, Becky Gladstone. We've known each other a long time, but I won't go into numbers. But I want to thank the League for all its good work and the occasional hospitality you've offered me. And now I'm living in Eugene again. I'm hoping I can do more work with you and your members. I want to start in on the topic and probably take up about half the time. For a law professor, it's a promise about how much he will talk. It's probably false, but I will do my best and see if we can get a discussion going and questions going in the second half of the time slot. I want to start with the fact we are at the beginning of a new Supreme Court term. A great deal of uncertainty is abroad in the country. Americans are asking, what are the prospects for the survival of our democracy? The Supreme Court is a part of this, a small part, or perhaps not the major part, but it's an important part. What will happen to the right to vote? What's going to happen to the right to choose and bodily autonomy? What's going to happen to the right of peaceable assembly? Are there any guardrails left? What can we do to make the situation better? I've been thinking about this, working on it since January. I have to say that our democratic system is facing the greatest challenge of our lifetimes. The forces hostile to democracy in this country are powerful, they are well-funded, they are on the move, and they have a plan. The country itself is deeply divided. People suspicious of each other along many axes, including geography, party, race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and general culture, whatever that means. Yet there are many Americans of goodwill. It's too easy to see things in blanket terms. Many Americans committed to democratic norms, committed to a system of fair elections, honest and open government, debate on issues, responsive representative legislation. Issues can be debated without the corrosive attack on the other side's motives, or even increasingly the threat of violence. It's been pretty common at least since January 6th, to invoke words of Lincoln that seemed to offer hope from his first inaugural address, where he addressed the white citizens of the slave state who were in the process of engineering so-called secession. And he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and heartstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." And ever since those words were uttered, Americans have believed that there is really a kindly tutelary spirit watching over our country, and that what binds us together, as politicians say, is stronger than the forces trying to drive us apart. That may be true today, but people who invoke the better angels sometimes overlook the fact that before those angels could sing, the United States had to pass through a catastrophic civil war to settle the disputes that gave rise to that conflict. And we need to walk through some very challenging times before we can get to a place where the angels will sing to us. How do we get there? One thing I'm going to say without hesitation, and that is, we don't get there by saying both sides are right, both sides need to compromise. I'm going to call that, perhaps unfairly, the find people on both sides trope, and we all recognize what that means. There are forces in our society, there are groups in our society, and some working from other countries who are actively trying to destroy the democratic system. And we won't frustrate that objective by sending reporters into diners to ask people why they feel bad, or by compromising on very basic questions of civil rights and constitutional principles. For example, compromising on the full faith and credit of the United States and saying, well, one side wants to default on the debt, the other side wants to borrow, can't they meet in the middle and borrow half, or whatever it is. Some of these things have to be settled. And I am also reminded in this context of other words of Lincoln's before he was elected, where he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Just so, I think in the long run, we can't be both a multicultural, multiracial democracy and also a racialized authoritarian state. We will become all one thing or all the other. So, with the promise of some more hopeful discussion later on, I'd like to begin by citing some long-term currents, some things from the past century and a half of American history that are flowing together in this decade, this third decade of the 21st, to pose a danger to our democratic system. We tend to regard our system as self-correcting, what the poet James Russell Lowell called a machine that would go of itself. It just can't drop into authoritarianism or civil disorder. I don't think that's true. I think history suggests that any nation has to face dangers and internal conflict and decay. And it's important to get out of this trap. We need to take a look at why we're in it. And the first and most important thing about our national life is so big that most of us, including myself, don't think about it very often. And that is the fact that until August 30th, with the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, the United States had been in a legal, authorized state of war for 20 years. Nothing like that has ever happened in American history before. I can't actually think of anything in the history of advanced democracies that corresponds to this 20 years. And it was not simply war. It's war against an invisible enemy that is explicitly conceived of as domestic as well as foreign, that is invisible. It's war on concepts, meaningless terms like war on terror, war on terrorism. It's war that potentially sweeps our neighbors into the enemy camp. What does that do to a democratic society? Well, when we assess that, and there are all kinds of different assessments, let's remember one thing that's very striking about American society, and that is that even before 9/11, the American imagination has been drawn to war as our national metaphor. I honestly I don't know of any cases where other democratic nations have gone to war with poverty, or war on cancer, war on, other countries may say we have a big problem, we need to tackle it, we need to make, but they don't invoke this language of battle, of strategy, of enemy, of total victory. The war metaphor is very and the war metaphor and the invisible enemy together begin to fray or even destroy those mystic chords of memory that Lincoln spoke of. Hate your neighbor, watch your neighbor, harm your neighbor, or the public impulse. And we can see the results of 2 decades of that on our streets every day. It's not a coincidence that violence against people from Islamic countries spiked in this country after the 9/11. It's not a coincidence that it spiked again after President Trump became president. It's not a coincidence that violence against Asian American and Pacific Island people spiked sharply after then President Trump christened COVID the China plague. We are ready, we are primed to find enemies within the gates. This is happening at a time, and this is the second negative force, I think, that the democratic impulse in the world has decayed. And we need to face the fact. If you think 20 years ago, I don't know how many people remember Francis Fukuyama. He's still around, but he's not quite the marquee star he was in the past. But he was the thinker who announced the end of history, that democracy as a form of government had triumphed. Democracies, he said, do not go to war with each other. The era of nation states competing, the era of competing ideologies was over. We had made it to the other side. Now, 20 years later, what's going on? Russia, which seemed like a sort of stumbling democracy, is now an authoritarian dictatorship. China, which seemed to be on a liberalizing path, has now begun to forge a totalitarian system that Orwell could not have imagined. Eastern Europe, Poland, and Hungary are moving into authoritarianism from their experiment with democracy. The far right is has not taken power in any of the central powers of Europe, that is France, Germany, Britain, but they are very powerful and on the move in the politics of those countries. In South America, democracy seems to be stumbling. The democratic movement in Myanmar has been an utter failure. Democratic impulses in 2021 are sailing against the wind, and we need to face that. Now, an internal, this may be somewhat controversial, but I think it's important to say, an internal factor that is undermining our commitment to democracy is change, a sea change that has occurred in many parts of white American Christian evangelicalism. American religion from the outside still looks very similar. You know, worship at the church of your choice. Evangelicals represent a huge percentage of American Christians. But within it, and particularly in the structures, the power structures that govern its politics, there's a very serious change in theology and political aim. We've seen the rise in evangelicalism of what's called dominionist theology, which was really a very minor thread in theology even years ago, now dominates some of the important institutions of white evangelical America. American Catholicism has, much of it has turned toward a kind of reconciliar conservatism. There's a philosophy, integralism, that is very similar to dominion theology. Both of these things overtly say that we must end the idea of a secular state and that we must have a state that is explicitly Christian. The nature of much of our religion, and I want to make clear, I was on my way to do that when we had this technical contretemps. I want to make clear that I am not asserting that any religious body, any religious group or denomination is a monolith and that the people within it all believe a certain thing. I'm describing some political, what we would call in another context, political changes in the structures, such as the conventions or national organizations of some denominations, and most particularly in those institutions that interact with Washington and with national power. The conservative and authoritarian domination of this is really quite startling. And those forces are powerfully backed by money whose source we are only dimly aware of. And that brings me to another very dangerous trend that is currently unchecked. And that is the trend toward economic inequality, to gross economic inequality, increasing distortion by the domination of politics, law, and even culture by a small clique of billionaires. Honestly, in the year 2000, who would have believed that the space race would be a question of whether Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos goes into space and which celebrity they take with them? It's surreal. But this has happened as it's happened to space exploration. It's happening in culture, it's happening in religion, and it is most assuredly happening in politics. Finally, I want to say that there's a constant in this process. And I recall some years ago when I was at U of O, I had the honor to be part of the group that met and entertained the Reverend James Lawson, who came to speak at our Martin Luther King Day holiday celebration. Lawson, I'm sure as most of you know, and bless his heart, he's still living, was the man who taught nonviolence to Martin Luther King at King's request. He had been in India studying Gandhian thought. He was an American, Black American, and he came back and he said, here are the tools that we will use in an attempt to dismantle racial apartheid in the American South. And King regarded him as the source of the nonviolent philosophy of the movement. And Lawson said to me, as we were talking about some contemporary phenomena, he said a very interesting thing. He said, the United States, this is paraphrased, but he said, the United States is never more than 90 days away from dictatorship, that there are always people and forces in our country who are ready to pull the plug on what we would consider freedom, who are ready to do as what Senator Tom Cotton recently said, just send in the military. You know, if Black Lives Matters demonstrators are demonstrating, clear the streets with the 82nd Airborne. That is a profound American impulse, and it's one that is very near the surface. And part of the reason for that is geographic. And I speak now as a Southerner, before anybody accuses me of regional bias. But the authoritarian ideology is a direct descendant of the Confederacy. And if you look at a red-blue map of the United States, and you will see something very striking if you look at it through the standpoint of Civil War history, and that is that the states of the old Union, that is the Northeast and the Upper Midwest, what used to be called the Old Northwest, those are blue, right? The core of red America, what Senator McConnell calls middle America, is the Old South, starting from Florida, sweeping up through Texas and Oklahoma. And it's now moved up into places like Kansas and Iowa, where it wasn't dominant before. And it is really descended from Confederate ideology. It is really descended from the pro-slavery argument. It poses a threat. It has achieved in those states already a great deal of compromise of the idea of self-government. It poses a threat to the rest of it. And its legislators and leaders are busily putting that in place. And then I have to say, the Constitution itself, much as I love it and have devoted years to understanding it, for reasons that are unavoidable and other reasons that are could be avoided, is an obstacle toward getting to where we need to get to. When I say the avoidable problems with the Constitution, we could fix the Electoral College if we wanted to. We came very close to doing so in the 1970s. And it had overwhelming support in both houses of Congress. It was halted by a filibuster. We could even fix the Senate if we use a little bit of creativity. But instead, we have an electoral college that gives us Donald Trump. And we have a Senate that is aptly described as the place democracy goes to die. If our country was governed by representatives of the majority, remember, first of all, Trump would never have been president. He lost the election by 2 million votes, the 2016 election. And he certainly wouldn't be running around claiming the election of 2020 was stolen from him. He lost that election by 7 million votes. You know, that's more than the population of nearly half the states. It's not credible, even for Trump, to say that many votes were somehow stolen or switched or smuggled in from Venezuela or whatever the latest My Pillow theory is. We simply would avoid a lot of problems by having a democratic country. Somebody wrote to me in part of this debate, you get online and all kinds of, and somebody said, well, suppose everyone in California voted for candidate X and everyone in New York voted for candidate X. And then in the rest of the country, a narrow majority voted for candidate Y. Who should win? And I wrote back and said in these words, the candidate who gets the most votes, duh. And that simple truism seems to elude Americans And the undemocratic nature of our Constitution is part of the reason why. But the other part of it, the thing that is really driving the Constitution into the ground is the unavoidable fact that no Constitution can contain all the rules. Constitutions have to be operationalized against a set of norms, against a set of democratic assumptions, or they're not going to work. And we saw this in 2016 when Justice Scalia died, and the president did his part. He nominated a nominee that the Republicans had already said they would confirm. They'd already committed to that. But then we found them saying, well, we don't really have to do this. And I regret to say there was a number of law professors who came out of the woodwork and said, oh, the Senate has no duty to consider the nominee. The Senate has no duty to give it an up or down vote. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that. To which my answer is, there's nothing in the Constitution that says they have to fund the military either. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they have to set up a Supreme Court. They do these things because they accede to the values of the Constitution. If they wanted to vote Judge Garland down, they certainly could have done it. That would be perfectly constitutional. But simply to refuse to do the job increasingly is a tactic. And the fact of the matter is, the Constitution doesn't say, oh, yes, pinky swear, cross your heart, you do the things that are in the Constitution. It doesn't, we don't have. The 14th Amendment says the debt of the United States, authorized by law, shall not be questioned. But the Republicans are now Republicans in the Senate are taking the position that, they'll pay the debt if they feel like it. They won't pay the debt if they don't feel like it. If Democrats don't give them what they want, they will destroy the economy. No Constitution can operate when one side just simply takes the view that it won't do anything that it doesn't have to do. So that brings me to my area, which is the Supreme Court. And we have regarded the court for a couple of generations as one of the guardrails, to make sure that government doesn't overreach and reach into our lives and prison us and so forth. And the court still claims that mantle. It claims that mantle rather insistently these days. My God, you can't turn on the radio without hearing some Supreme Court justice whining about how the public doesn't respect them enough, doesn't kiss the hem of their garments, doesn't see how great they are, doesn't regard them as legitimate. And they claim that, but increasingly the court's intervention in a national life is not to call balls and strikes, in Chief Justice Roberts' phrase. It's to stop play whenever one side scores and call the ball back. In some areas, this has been going on for 20 years, and it's had a very serious and corrosive effect on our democratic system. The first, I think everyone here understands, is campaign finance. The second is partisan gerrymandering and the court's endorsement of that. The third is the current contempt for the constitutional right to vote in cases like Shelby County and Brnovich, where the court basically says obstacles to the right to vote are not an important problem. Religious freedom jurisprudence increasingly is becoming a kind of opt-out of our national life, that anti-discrimination norms can be canceled by certain religious claims, not all. And then finally, the Second Amendment. District of Columbia versus Heller is a very badly run, dishonest decision. It should have come out the other way. The ultra-conservative court, however, is poised to expand that, is poised to make sure there are more guns in American life. I take this very seriously. I don't know who else, I know you're from all over the county, but I live in the Jefferson West Side neighborhood of Eugene. And a week after my wife and I moved here last year, we were sitting in the little park near our house, literally watching little girls play with hoops. When seemingly out of nowhere, 12 armed men with masks and semi-automatic rifles appeared and took up firing positions around a perimeter where a political rally was being held. You can't carry on a democratic system where guns are that important. And Jill Lepore, the great historian who writes also for the New Yorker, said 10 years ago, when carrying a concealed weapon for self-defense, which is the issue before the court, is understood not as a failure of civil society to be mourned, but as an act of citizenship to be vaunted, there is little left of civilian life. So what can we do? Okay. What do we have to do? And the first thing is we need to safeguard our democracy here in Oregon. Now, Oregon is a blue state. It's very blue. We tend, I think, to be a little relaxed about what that means. But there's all kinds of political currents in this country, and there are all kinds of political currents in this state that we need to be aware of. The very far right, the extremists have announced, I mean, they're very open about it, that their plan is to take over school boards and boards of supervisors and impose their political values on localities to work from the ground up. And I think it's really important that the kind of people who have come to this meeting, reach out, go the extra mile to go to the school board meeting to make, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but still, it is tremendously important that we not end up like the people in Newburgh, whose school board has banned Black Lives Matter and Pride flags because they conflict with their values and they alarm them and they scare them. We have a problem with law enforcement in this state. We have a number of elected sheriffs in Oregon who take the position that they have the constitutional power to overturn federal or state law. This is not true. It's gibberish. And it needs to be combated in a civic way, simply by let's get the truth about these things out so people in places like Polk County and Grant County can assess these claims that are being made. We also have to be aware that there are going to be pressures from the other states, and if we have a change of administration from the federal government to force Oregon to change some of its practices. We're going to see efforts to force states to restrict the franchise, not to extend it, not to extend the values that we have in Oregon of wanting people to vote. Now I think we can win this fight in Oregon. I really do. Because if you look at the contrast between what happened in Washington on January 6th, where the Republican caucus of the Congress has now embraced a violent assault on the government with nooses. Do you remember nooses? That's now a patriotic, peaceful exercise, to the extent that at a rally for Virginia gubernatorial candidate, I'm from Virginia, I take this very personally, the way I took Charlottesville, the candidate for the Republican nominee for governor, there was a rally with President Trump in his behalf where they brought a flag onto the stage and said this flag was carried by the protesters on January 6th. We will all pledge allegiance to this flag. So, but in Oregon, something very different happened. As we all know, we had an assault on the state capitol in December. And fascinatingly enough, and I hasten to add, and I think we all know, that the current formal status of the Republican Party, not Republicans writ large, but the party, is really quite different from what it was 30 years ago when Dave Frohnmeyer recruited me to come to this state and work here and be part of the system. They're much more conservative, much further right. And yet, these very people responded when they found out that Representative Neerman had been a conspirator to the Capitol. They responded exactly the way people who believe in democracy would do. Neerman was expelled not by a partisan vote, but by 59-1. So there is still in Oregon a core that does bind us all to democratic values and which can make our advocacy effective and show us how to phrase it. Now, what do we do about the fact that large swaths of the country seem to be making very malign changes in their political system? Well, we mobilize. I think we are going to have to look to a period like the civil rights movement, where things like SB 8 in Texas or the Georgia voting bill become national issues because a movement makes them and goes there. Particularly the way people went to Selma, or Montgomery to Memphis, or marches of this sort, because from inside, they are closing off the channels of peaceful change. What else can we do? Well, for the love of heaven, let's get some kind of voting rights legislation done in this Congress. Otherwise, it may be too late. I don't have to tell you the details. You know much more than I do. Our senators and representatives, by and large, Oregon, understand the issue, but anything you can do to light fire under them or to reach out to legislators in other states before it's too late is really essential. We can support movements that advocate democratic reform in other states. Twice a month, I volunteer for something called the Election Protection Hotline, and which is run by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And it's nonpartisan, but what we do is try to help people ascertain their registration status. If there's problems, casting a vote, help them even with a provisional ballot and so forth. And I've had wonderful conversations with voters who are always grateful, and we are nonpartisan. We never ask who. I did have a call a few months ago from a voter who said that he was for Donald Trump all the way. And I said, well, I'm not asking you that. But he said, well, I went down to my polls and I saw people voting without any ID. And this is fraudulent. And I said, well, we have databases, that we can look up the voting law of any of the 50 states. And I went through it and I had to tell this gentleman, I said, not only is it okay under the law of your state for those people to be voting without ID, you, because you haven't voted in 12 years, will have to show a voter ID. Right? And you think, given the state of the dialogue in this country, that this would be World War III. But the guy said, oh, I'm really glad you told me that. I'm going to go get my ID. Thank you so much. It's just a wonderful kind of way to reach across the divide. And to the extent that we can help people in other states exercise the franchise, we really are making things a lot better. We need to support local journalism. It's very important. Studies show that political extremism thrives in those parts of the country where local media have died. In Oregon, we're still, pretty lucky by comparison with the carnage that's taken place elsewhere. We have the Oregonian and the Register Guard, which both are trying to do a good job with very limited tools. We have OPB, Willamette Week. We have KLCC, JPR. I was thrilled to find that my personal idol, the great Leszeitz, one of the greatest reporters in Oregon history, has now started a new enterprise called the Salem Reporter, which I encourage people to subscribe to because it's going to provide another independent voice on what's happening in the state capitol and in the state generally. So these are all things we can do. I don't think that the battle is lost. I think that we're in a very dangerous situation, and that people need to regard it as such. And, for this moment, I would say that it's not so much the better angels that we need to look to as a different part of Lincoln's wisdom from his first annual message to Congress, December 1st, 1862. He said, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." So with that, I'll take your questions and thank you for your attention. No Q&A here. Let's see.
There are a couple of questions in Q&A. I wonder if we might venture to risk putting the audio back on or the video back on.
Sure. I given my looks, I assume people treated this as a respite rather than a deprivation, but let me give it a shot. Unable to start video. Host has stopped it.
Oh, hi, Amanda.
Sorry, I thought I allowed you to do that.
Yeah, but then I went off again, and it, for whatever reason, it.
Oh, I wonder if
some
that's why.
Automatic thing.
Let's see here.
So Donna Cohen is asking a couple of additional ideas for mobilizing in other states or helping in other states. And I would add, while you're thinking about that the League is a member of the Election Protection Hotline, and I was thrilled to see that you were participating with that. Thank you very much.
It's not only worthwhile, it's like super fun. It really is a chance to talk to people when they're very open about things. What else can we do in other states? Well, I think the first, I mostly write about the Supreme Court. I have done some reaching out. I did a little reporting on, for example, what happened in Graham, North Carolina, if people remember, where voters marching to the polls during early voting with a parade permit were set upon by police officers with shields and batons and arrested for daring to do that. So, I have a small sense of how bad things can get out there, and that there are parts of the country where it's not that the attitudes from the segregated period are coming back. It's not that at all. It's that they never left. If you look at things that go on in Mississippi, parts of North Carolina, Georgia, parts of Georgia, that's really what's going on. And I think that rather than me come up with a list, we should reach out to the groups in those states and see what they need. I serve on some nonprofit boards. I have talked to our members who work in Texas. One young woman who is a law student and of Latino heritage said that between fighting to keep her right to vote and working with other women who are desperate to find abortion resources, she's just overwhelmed. She is just just emotionally drained every day. And I think to the extent that people can from outside offer support, people can go there. My generation, I was too young and I regret it. But my generation, a lot of college students spent their summer in Mississippi, the Freedom Summer. Some gave their lives, in order to further the right to vote and participate in the end to Southern apartheid. And I would like to see us sending people down there to help in these local struggles, because it's going to be a long way, right? I mean, we're not going to get to a point where the Texas legislature holds a special session and repeals all the laws. It's going to take a long time, and we can't count on the courts. The courts are not our friends. And so it's going to take a lot of organizing on the ground. And, you know, it might be useful to put together a list of resources like that. I might try to do that. And if I do, I'll pass it on to Becky, and she can pass it on to you all. But I think everybody, you know, you can get online, you can see which the groups are that are doing things, and ask them, ask people there on the ground. Start my video. Here we go.
Professor Epps, we have a couple of people asking about Leszeitz.
Yeah. Who is he?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry,
well,
I don't know.
Leszeitz. I mean, you know, I started in the first 15 years of my career. I was a newspaper man before I went to law school. So, you know, my idols are always usually the little person sitting in the corner with a notepad, right? Who goes to enormous lengths to print the facts, even though people don't want them printed. Leszeitz is, I think, one of the few reporters in history who has been the target of not one, but two entirely separate assassination conspiracies because of his practice of writing about divisive social issues. He wrote spearheaded the 20-part series on Rajneeshpuram that the Oregonian ran back when that was a current issue. And he is still, he retired from the Oregonian, I think 2 years ago. He bought the Malheur Enterprise, the newspaper down there. And now he is organizing and in fact, the second conspiracy to kill him arose out of the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Reserve. And he's now brought a group of young journalists together. He's raising money for them to be the Salem Reporter, to be one of these online news resources that are popping up around the country, like the Texas Tribune. And I think it's going to be a tremendous asset to the state.
Super, thank you.
Yes.
It seems there are simple reforms to the filibuster rules that could help. For example, a senator has to be on the floor and talking for the whole time. And Robin, one of our UN representatives from the League actually is asking what you think about that, if you would comment.
Well, I certainly think it would be better than what we have now, right? Nobody can talk in an unlimited way. Now, this is an emotional issue for me, and if you'll pardon me saying this, somebody was in my face and sort of saying, if you mess with the filibuster, you'll regret it. And I said to this person, this is one of the prerogatives of being an old geezer. I said, where were you on June 10th, 1964? What were you doing on June 10th, 1964? Do you remember where you were on June 10th, 1964? And the person looked a little surprised and said, no. And I said, I do, because that is the day that after a century, the Senate broke a filibuster against civil rights legislation. And it was done with the greatest of difficulty. The vote was so close that Senator Claire Engel, at that time, the senator from California, who was dying of cancer, had to be wheeled onto the Senate floor on a gurney. And when the clerk called his name and said, what say you, aye or nay? Senator Engel, who could not talk, pointed to his eye. And the Civil Rights Bill was enacted. And the part of the world I grew up in was liberated. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, if we got rid of the filibuster entirely, I wouldn't grieve. But if we need to keep it, if we can't go that far, then I think that a one-person filibuster would be fine. Now, what we don't want is the tag team filibuster. That was the filibuster that was used in 1964, that was used against the anti-lynching bills before that. It was used against voting right bills, you know, during the Wilson administration, where 3 or 4 senators can tag each other and just keep talking until the nation is paralyzed. one person, that would be fine. I mean, we all know, we're Oregonians, we all know about Wayne Morse, and how he could talk for a long time, and usually was talking on something that we think of as pretty praiseworthy. We've also seen Senator Cruz reading Green Eggs and Ham because he wants to destroy the Affordable Care Act. But the fact of the matter is, he had to stop. So what you can do now is just say, I object. That's all. You don't have to stand up even. Rand Paul blocked the anti-lynching bill just by saying, I object. And then you have to have 60 votes to proceed to a vote. And we have to get rid of that. That's insane. It's always been insane. It's not like conditions have changed and the good old Senate was great, but now we have the bad Senate. It was always terrible. And the Senate was always a problem. It's 100 years ago, one of the muckraking journalists wrote a book called The Treason of the Senate, where he just went through and illustrated that the Senate was the complete handmaiden of concentrated capital and paid no attention to democracy. So, we need to tackle the issue of the Senate, and the filibuster is part of that. I'm sorry, I got a little carried away. Okay, good. I'm better now. It's fine.
We have a lot of questions. Take a breath. This one, I'll take them in order, but this one is could be a big question or a lengthy response. Can you explain what upcoming court decisions worry you?
Well, yeah, I can do it quickly, or I can do it in more detail. But I think really important ones are the New York Pistol and Rifle Association case, in which the court is being asked and seems disposed to simply say that every state must allow concealed carry of weapons, regardless of the reason. In New York, you can get a concealed permit, but you have to give a reason why you need it, right? I guard the bank deposits, or I'm a security at this or that place, or I've been threatened, and gun lobby regards that as intolerable. They want you to be able to go in and sign up, no matter who you are, for a concealed weapon permit. And then we have the Dobbs case, which is the Mississippi 16-week abortion ban bill. And that may offer, it's fascinating to me to try to figure out what's going on behind the scenes, but that may offer the court majority a chance to simply say either the Roe and Casey line of cases is overruled, or that the doctrine of Casey is narrowed so much that it is no longer really an obstacle to legislative efforts to ban abortion. Those are big ones. There are also some fairly serious cases about the independence of regulatory agencies. And one of the programs of the conservative legal movement has been to cripple the act of things like, they particularly hate the Consumer Finance Protection Board, but the NLRB, the EEOC, and they're attacking these as because they want the president to be able to appoint and remove the members. And these independent agencies, the commissioners, serve for fixed terms and can only be removed for cause. And that's an important part of keeping regulation on an even keel in this country. So that's something else to look at. That's what comes off the top of my head.
I'm going to pull executive privilege here because you talked about changing the composition of those commissions and so forth. There's a lot of talk. President Biden came out flatly against term limits on the Supreme Court last night, speaking about it. But I wonder if you could talk, if you had omniscient power and you could make appointments to the Supreme Court work the way you would like them to be, given that we've had, no, we have an election coming up. You can't possibly appoint someone in this short term of what was it, 8 months versus, oh, we have to do this now. We have 3 weeks. Let's make this happen.
Yes.
How would you fix that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of, I was in a meeting the other day where somebody poked up and said, I'm from Britain and we don't have judicial review there. Let's propose that. I don't think that that's the way our system's going to work. I think we need a court of final appeal that can resolve, for the moment, constitutional questions and also very important statutory issues. When the Congress passes a law, what does it mean? But the idea that these 9 people, the idea that Clarence Thomas could have 1/9 of the judicial power of the United States for 30 years, the idea that, what happens to individual rights depends on the course of a disease that Ruth Bader Ginsburg unfortunately had. It just makes no sense. It makes even less sense than the filibuster. And the reform that I like, because I think that the political appointment Senate confirmation process over the course of American history has actually given us some really remarkable judges, has actually worked in some cases really quite well. And I would hate to take a court with the power of the Supreme Court and vest the appointing power in some kind of intermediate body or lawyer's body, the way it is in a lot of civil law countries. But I think a proposal that was made, and that almost certainly I think could be done without constitutional amendment, was made by my old colleague Paul Carrington from Duke University, has been extensively discussed. And that is that we have a court in which every president gets 2 appointments during his term, and 1 every 2 years, right? And those, they go on the court. The other judges of the court, of course, remain justices, just the way senior judges in our system remain federal judges. No one says that life tenure has been abrogated by having judges go senior. And they would, there would be, once the system's up and running, there would be 18 appointees. The senior 9 would be senior. They would not have a vote unless one of the junior 9 couldn't, is conflicted out or something, that they would fill in. I think you would see the same pressure, or maybe even more, to make a quality appointment. I mean, one of the amazing things, this is sort of taken for granted now, but it really wasn't the case in much of our history, is the idea that when you want to appoint a Supreme Court justice, you go out and you go out on the playground and try to find some kid playing marbles and put him on the court so that he can serve for the next 100 years. That's just a crazy ambition. Presidents didn't used to do that, and they shouldn't. And with a system in which you have people rotating out of into senior status, it wouldn't happen, because a Supreme Court career would be 18 years. Now, people defend the life tenure system by saying, well, we want people who are, independent, and we don't want them worrying about what their next job will be and so forth. I gotta say that if you're appointed a Supreme Court justice in the United States and you serve 18 years and you want another job, I predict you will have your choice. I predict you don't need life tenure to protect you from ending up in the gutter with a sign that says, used to be Supreme Court Justice, please help. It won't happen. And I don't think the kind of people that would emerge from our system would be the kind of people who would bend themselves because they want to do something after an 18-year term. So that's what I'd like to see. There's other proposals to have panels of Supreme Court justices, rotating panels, and those are good too. Those are good proposals. I think that there are ways to do term limits for justices that are not constitutional, that are not unconstitutional. There are also ways that are unconstitutional, and it have to be done very carefully. And unfortunately, the last word on it would be had by the current Supreme Court. But I have to say, and as someone who, enthusiastically supports this administration on the whole, the idea that we are taking court reform off the table in the fall of 2021 astounds me. It is flabbergasting. It is like, unilaterally disarming. There's no prospect that we're going to change the composition of the court in this Congress, right? It's perfectly clear. We've got a 50-50 Senate that is not going to adopt any of these plans. But we need to be advancing them because something serious has gone wrong with the court. And, Becky, you described part of it, which is the manipulation. People say to me, oh, the Democrats are going to pack the court. Hello. The court is already packed. It was packed by McConnell, who took seats that were not rightfully to be filled and insisted, Banana Republic style, on jamming people into them. And these nominees, to be honest, I'm a little underwhelmed by them. And the idea that Brett Kavanaugh is now on the court after his performance in front of the Judiciary Committee, I still am pinching myself over that one. I'm sorry. It's a little bit like saying to Ahab, "You've seen a white," you get me started and I can't stop. So I'll stop there.
I will pass on this question from our premium advocate of national popular vote. What's your view on national popular vote in states across the country? Does it have a chance of success, or must we rely on amending the Constitution?
Well, let me just say first that I think the NPVI is a wonderful bit of creativity and thought and constitutional contribution to our constitutional dialogue. I'm very impressed by it. My former colleague, Jamie Raskin, engineered Maryland's adherence to that while I was working for the state of Maryland. I'm extremely proud of him, and I'm proud of Maryland for doing it. I think that getting states to sign on to it on the whole is a good thing. But I regard that because it has two functions. One is it may actually work. We may get 270 electoral votes, states, to agree to the proposal, at which point, if it goes into effect the way it's designed, we would have a popular vote. If we don't get there, it brings a lot of pressure, political pressure on the Congress to go ahead and propose that amendment, which, as I say, as recently as 40 years ago, was not particularly controversial. And everyone says, when you bring up constitutional amendment, the average person says, just like this, never going to happen. And then the discussion stops, right? Well, NPVI gets people thinking about what a system of popular election would look like, and gets around this kind of block that people have about constitutional amendments. And it may be that we'll come to constitutional amendment. But before we go there, let me just say the one worry I have about NPVI is that the mechanism for enforcing this, the mechanism for requiring the states with 270 votes to actually cast them in favor of the winner of the popular vote, is an interstate compact. And this is in the weeds for most people. But the interstate compact clause, I believe it's Article 1, Section 10, but I'm not, don't hold me to that, basically says that interstate compacts, contracts between states, the framers did not want states to be carrying on their own foreign policies inside the country, being Mississippi ambassador to Alabama and so forth. So they have to get the approval of Congress. Now, that's not true of every interstate compact. Over the years, rules have evolved to say that certain compacts that have to do with states' own operations and so forth don't need congressional approval. But a couple of things could happen. Now, let me just back up and say, right now, the system for choosing presidents, put aside the fact that it's undemocratic, it's incredibly stupid. It doesn't operate. It's like some, I always liken America with the Electoral College as like a character in one of the old Three Stooges videos, who is a painter and who's getting ready to paint, and meanwhile the jar of paint is on a rope, and it swings down and smacks him in the head, knocks him down, and he looks around and he can't see anything, so he gets up and starts painting again, and it comes back the other way. And it's funny to watch, not so funny to have happen, but that's what the Electoral College has been doing to the United States since 1788. And we have the letters from Hamilton saying, it occurred to me that some people might sabotage the election of Washington by withholding their votes. This is the first presidential election ever held. We've got to prevent this. This could go off the rails. In 1796, sorry, Washington served 2 terms. It completely misfired by making Jefferson the vice president. Adams had a running mate, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, but instead of that, he had Jefferson sitting in the Senate conspiring to overthrow him. I mean, I'm sort of pro-Jeffersonian in a sense, but poor Adams, he had everything. The Electoral College did that, and everybody's like, oh my God. In 1800, it brought the country to the brink of civil war. The Virginia militia was preparing to march on Washington if the House had not made Jefferson president. So, the bucket keeps swinging back and forth. Rutherford B. Hayes, George W. Bush, Donald Trump. At some point, we have to look and say, oh, it's that bucket. It doesn't work. It's incredibly rickety. It falls apart at the slightest breath. And so I'm a little worried about introducing yet another stochastic element into that mix, because I can imagine that a state that adheres to the NPVI would have a change of parties in the legislature, and that legislature would then, after the election, repudiate the compact. Now, that's not supposed to happen. There's supposed to be protective mechanisms in the compact system that keep that from happening. But in the end, that issue would go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's record of involvement in our presidential elections is kind of grim. So, I say, if you're working on NPVI, God bless you. It's the Lord's work. And I think eventually we may get there. But as someone who's paid to sit around and worry, that's my worry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marge, let's talk about that. Let's do a dizzying change of topic here from our friend Carlene. Many of us support women's right to choose, but I'm waiting for the right wing to speak about our push to get them to vaccinate and mask up. They're claiming it's their right to choose. How do we square those positions?
You can't. I talked about authoritarian ideology in my talk. And, there's never, I'm a professor, so there's never enough time for me to say everything that I'm thinking. And one of the parts that I would like to make clear in response to this question is that an important part of authoritarianism as it's being spread in our country and in much of the world is misogyny. That, the restrictions on abortion are simply part of a sort of in part religiously inspired movement to return women to a subordinate position in society. And so if you ask me what's the difference, I'd say, well, one affects men and women and the other affects only women. And so, from the point of view of the people putting them in place, what Mel Brooks said, tragedy is if I get a hangnail If you fall down a manhole and break your head, that's comedy, right? In other words, what happens to women is not the compromise of autonomy. And, this is made very clear. The authors of SB 8 have now filed a amicus brief in the Dobbs case, in which they make the statement that people who criticize SB 8 say that banning abortion compromises women's bodily integrity. Nothing could be further from the truth. Women have complete bodily integrity. All they have to do is not engage in sex, and they have no problems. I mean, that is the level of thought and discourse that is going on. And I certainly hope nobody thinks that the anti-choice movement would stop with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So they could say, oh, good, in our states, we can ban abortion. In Oregon, you can have the right to choose. No, they will be coming for the right to choose. And there's a brief in front of the court from two very prominent conservatives saying the court should rule that abortion itself is unconstitutional. If you ask me what the difference is, I would say there really is no difference. For more than 100 years, we've had situations where the government has to invade people's bodily practices. We've had, the Supreme Court has approved mandatory vaccination, but the other side sees it differently. And I think they see it in this case through a lens of misogyny. And it is very frightening to me, and I assume to many people on this call.
Professor Epps, you mentioned working with people in Georgia. What do you think of Stacey Abrams' organization Fair Fight for helping with voting rights?
I think Stacey Abrams is really one of the most impressive figures in American politics today. And I haven't interacted with Fair Fight, in great detail, but I know they've been very effective. And I think if anybody wants to help people who need help securing the right to vote, that would be a great place to start. And if they don't need help, they'll tell you other reputable groups that do, right? I don't think going on Facebook and looking, for progressive groups is a good idea, because, many of them are good heart. Some of them are, probably run out of Belarus, but many of them are good-hearted but ineffective. And you can do some research and find out the good ones. Fair Fight, I think the result in Georgia in 2020 and 2021, flows directly out of Fair Fight's activities, because Georgia had already begun choking off access to the polls, and Fair Fight fought them to a standstill.
I don't know if you can see the chat. Someone else is asking a follow-up to the abortion question. Isn't another difference between vaccine mandates and abortion limits this? The former addresses a public health issue, while the latter comprises a personal family choice.
I see that's a very good distinction. I hadn't formulated it in that sense. I think abortion has a public health aspect to it. And the lack of availability of abortion has a great deal to do with the bad state of public health, the bad state of, if you look at the figures for Louisiana and Mississippi, the places that are most hostile to choice, you will see that they're not particularly concerned about keeping infant mortality down. But I certainly think that's a good point to make. I do think, again, the two sides on this issue are talking to each other across a vast gulf. And I think that the kind of people that wrote the brief saying abortion is unconstitutional don't regard it as a family choice. They regard it as an assault on the integrity of the state. And the court, of the government, of the society, the court has actually, to some small extent, bought into this. And we may see more of that in the case that has to do with, I think it's Stenberg versus Carhart. No, it's Carhart versus Gonzalez. The case that had to do with the federal partial birth Abortion Act, you had Justice Kennedy approving that partial birth statute in part because he says it's very important for society that doctors not become killers. Doctors must not be, the role of the doctor must not be compromised. And if they begin doing, if they're running around doing partial birth abortions, then they'll come to think of themselves as killers and others will. So, there are ways you can bring it into the public sphere. What do I regard? I certainly regard it as a personal choice, and that's something that women should make freely for reasons of their own. And one of the great strengths of the legal, our constitutional law of abortion is all over the lot, but one of the great strengths is that it says until viability, a woman can choose abortion for any reason and doesn't have to explain. I don't see why women should have to explain to hospital boards or Senator McConnell or Justice Gorsuch or anybody else decisions made before viability. So I sort of rambled around the question, but there you go.
Thank you for those answers. And I have to say, the League has strong positions on many of these issues, sometimes limited by our volunteer capacity. So if you're listening to this and you care about these things and wonder why we're not more active, join us. We do have another question.
Yes.
The Federalist Society versus democracy. Can you speak on this a bit?
I can. I think it's really important not to mistake a symptom for a diagnosis. The Federalist Society is a pretty broad group, and I have friends and colleagues who are inside it and whom I regard as trustworthy partners. That is, if I were going to say, what about this idea, they would give the conservative view of it, and I'd listen, and because I'd regard it as being sincerely given. It also includes some pretty extreme people. And I think one of the things that has really puzzled and worried and grieved me in the past 5 years is to see that group transformed into something different. This is the group that gave a standing ovation to Jeff Sessions after he left office as Attorney General. I said to one of my friends, what? Standing ovation? The guy's an idiot, and he said, well, but he followed the law. I said, he gets a standing ovation for following the law? He's the goddamn Attorney General. Of course he followed the law. Yeah, is that really a choice? And the guy, he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. Then they had the standing ovation for Bill Barr, and that speech is one of the most chilling authoritarian documents that we've produced in the last 10 years. And one of the things that's happened, and one of the things that is why the guardrails of democracy are potentially in trouble, is, and I kind of take my view of this from a Hawthorne story called Young Goodman Brown, in which in the 17th century, a Salem colonist goes out into the woods and falls asleep and dreams that he sees everyone from his village worshiping Satan and conducting blood sacrifices on a satanic idol, altar and everything else. And then when he wakes up, for the rest of his life, he isn't really sure whether the other people in town are really good people or are secretly Satanists. And we've had our Young Goodman Brown moment. I call him Young Goodman Barr, where people who had conducted themselves, in a relatively responsible way on the right side of political issues, bent the knee to Donald Trump. And the reason is that he clearly was saying, do this and I will give you the power you have dreamed of your whole life. All you have to do is give up your belief in sincerity and the rule of law, in equality, and I will give you what you need. And the influence on people like Barr has been just dreadful. And I think of Trump as the source of the malaise that affects the bench more than the Federalist Society. They certainly were happy to step up and provide names. But, you know, it was the choice of the White House to jam those names through and to nominate people, you know, people who didn't know what motion in limine was. I mean, you know, morons, you know, people who had been sort of policy lounge lizards ever since law school being put on the trial bench. That was a decision that was made not by the Federalists, but by the administration. And I will also say I have seen some people in the Federalist Society become extremists because of the temptations of Donald Trump. And I will tell you, frankly, don't know how people will react to this, that John Eastman has been a friend of mine for 20 years. We opposing each other ideologically, but we had a couple of debates, and are very good spirited. And I thought of him as a good colleague. I don't recognize that guy. I don't recognize the author of that memo as the person I knew. And I think that kind of, you know, when you tell people, when you whisper in people's ears, you don't have to follow the law. You can have what you want. It has a really bad effect on many people's morality. I've never been tempted that way, and, you know, probably won't ever. But, you know, it's very hard for people to resist. So the Federalist Society is part of the problem. They're not quite as much of a conspiracy as they've been made out to be. But on the other hand, the other thing about the Federalist Society to be aware of, and I'm on the board of the American Constitution Society, which is kind of trying to do some of the same things from a progressive point of view. And we barely have bus fare. The Federalist Society is funded by more dark money than you can imagine. We don't know where the money's coming from. They have all the money they need. They fly their people around. They put them up in 4-star hotels to give these speeches and so forth. And it is troubling. The influence of dark money on our judicial selection is not limited to the Federalist Society, because, you know, there was so much, the Judicial Crisis Network, when Justice Gorsuch was nominated, had so much money to run ads. We don't know where it came from. They haven't disclosed it. To run ads in behalf of him, that after he was confirmed, they did a $2 million ad buy to say, we're so glad Justice Gorsuch was confirmed. I mean, they're awash in money. And that money has influenced who sits on the bench and so forth. And I worry about that a little more than the Federalist Society. But I do think there's some questions that need to be raised about it. I don't want to see people pilloried just because they're members. I think there are a lot of perfectly fine people who are members or who work with the Federalist Society. You know, Justice Kagan said at a meeting of the Harvard Federalist Society when she was dean of the law school, she said, and this is pure Kagan, she said, I love the Federalist Society, but you are not my people. And I think that's the way I feel.
I have put in a query if anyone has any further questions, but I'm not seeing any. We could perhaps take another couple of minutes. Thank you, Professor Epps, for joining us.
Well, thank you for your attention.
I hope we can get the recording sorted out. We probably can.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you to our events committee. Thank you to our staff. Thank you to our donors, the Carol and Velma Saline Foundation, for financial support. We recognize the challenge of these contentious political times and welcome you to join the League. Share website for election and legislative action. We're already getting our ducks in a row for the 2022 elections. As soon as these almost fully redistricted boundaries come into place. I don't have anything further to add. Thank you for joining us. Anybody else? You're getting thank yous.
Well, thank you for listening. A retired professor will go anywhere to be listened to. I talk to the squirrels most of the time, so this is great. All right, everybody. Thank you so much and enjoy the weekend.
Thank you. You too. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.